Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Australia at Home discussion about the US election post-mortem. It's been a wild 24 hours, but hopefully we've got a panel here to help come to grips with what it all means. I'm Jacob Verghese. I'm the CEO of Maurice Blackburn, who's supporting this event. And can I just start by, as we always do, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, but also pay our respects to traditional owners of the various lands that you're all dialing in from as well, and pay respects to their elders past and present. And of course, extend our welcome and thank you for the participation of any First Nations people on the call today. This is going to be an interesting discussion. One piece of housekeeping, though, is it does help if you keep your camera on, because for those people who are on the panel, it's lovely to be able to make eye contact or something like a proxy for eye contact and feel that there's an engagement back from the audience. You can join the conversation at any time using the chat function in Zoom, and I can ask those questions on your behalf, or we can turn to you and give you an opportunity to ask the question by video. You can let us know in the chat how you want to deal with that. I just want to remind you that we are recording this event, so just be aware of that. That probably implies you want to be even more respectful than you normally be, but I'm sure everyone would be respectful anyway. And if there are any IT issues, you can also put them in the chat, and we'll hopefully be able to help you out. So the panelists today are sharing their personal views about the election. It really is an opportunity for some hot takes. No one's really had a chance for detailed analysis at this point, especially given it's been a bit of a roller coaster. But everyone is just sharing their initial thoughts. Let me introduce you to the panel. Firstly, we're very lucky as a mob of Australians talking about a foreign country's election, notwithstanding that we've all been very interested. We actually have an actual American. The benefit is she's an Australian American, recently an American citizen, but born and bred in Brisbane, and actually joining us from Brisbane, which is Katie Connolly, who's the Senior Vice President of the Benenson Strategy Group. Katie's worked as a pollster on the Obama re-election campaign in 2012, the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and in this election cycle worked on Mayor Pete's primary campaign. I think one of the few people on the call who actually voted in yesterday's election, I think for the first time got to vote in an American election. So well done, Katie. We also have Terry Butler MP, who's the member for Griffith in Queensland, and is the Shadow Minister for Environment and Water. Thank you, Terry. We have Peter Lewis, who I think will be known to all of you as the driving force behind the Australia at Home project, but also the Executive Director of Essential Media and an editor at The Guardian, or the editor at The Guardian. No,
not an editor at The Guardian. I write the odd column, but I'm not going to claim Lenore's job.
Sorry, I know that was my notes were in error there. But Peter is amongst many things, knows a lot about polling, which could become quite relevant today. And then Michael Cooney, who's the General Manager of Public Affairs at Maurice Blackburn, and before that, a very seasoned political operative in Australian politics. And can provide us a bit of perspective there. So I just thought to start off with just a quick go round amongst the panel on your predictions. Where are we at? What's going to happen? I think it would be good to get that clear. If people have differing views, that'd be good to know when we get into the other discussion. So Katie, can I ask you first, how are you feeling? Where do you think the presidency is going to land? What's going to happen in the Senate and the House?
I feel very good this morning. I think Biden is inching his way towards a victory, and it's going to be a convincing victory. You know, he's going to win the popular vote by probably about 5 million, which is enormous. He will have received more votes than any candidate in history for the presidency. He looks like he's won the states of Wisconsin and Michigan and is well on his way to winning Pennsylvania. I'm very confident about Nevada and Arizona as well. And I think there's an outside shot of winning Georgia. And all of that, if he gets those things, puts him over 300 electoral votes. So if you'd said to me, a week ago that we were going to be the day after election, that Joe Biden would have restored the blue wall, would have flipped Arizona, potentially flipped Georgia, flipped Nebraska's second congressional district, unseated an incumbent president, which has only been done so far 3 times in American history, and made Trump a one-term president, I would have been thrilled. And so I am thrilled right now. I think the Senate does not look as good for Democrats. It was always, despite all of the predictions, it was always on us to pick up a lot of seats. And that was going to be difficult. And I don't think we'll get beyond 50 there. But let's not take anything away from what Joe Biden has accomplished here, which is a very convincing and important victory for Democrats and an important victory, in my view, for democracy.
Great, thanks. Terry, what about you? Where are you feeling the race is at?
Well, obviously defer to Katie. I don't know about everyone else on the call, but I feel great after listening to Katie. So thank you, Katie, very much. It's certainly been a stressful time for us here in Australia, of course, because Australians have a lot riding on this race, and we've all, I think, been paying a lot of attention to it, not just because, of course, the US is such a significant trading and security partner for us, but also because of the impact that the US's international leadership, or lack of it, can have on the future of the planet via the climate change movement. So something that we've all been watching very closely, but of course I have to defer to Katie, and sounds great. Absolutely wonderful news across the election, and obviously looking forward to seeing the formalisation of the outcome, subject to, of course, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, Jacob, the threats of litigation from the Trump camp. Yeah,
we will definitely talk about that. Peter, do you have any different views about where the race is at?
No, it feels like Biden will get to the magic number. For those that were joining us on this for our watch party yesterday, I think the mood is a little bit more upbeat than it was when we were watching Florida not deliver and the early votes coming in. And I've just been reflecting overnight, like many people, I was looking at Nate Silver's projections and the 90% chance of Biden winning. And I think some of us read that for Biden getting 90% of the vote, which was never going to actually happen. And I guess where we've landed is there is likely to be the end of the Trump presidency, but probably not the repudiation of the Trump era that some of us from the cheap seats were hoping for.
Michael, do you want to add anything about where you're sitting?
I'm always struck that relief is such a powerful emotion. It's probably, I didn't feel very emotionally engaged in this election really until about noon yesterday, and suddenly my gut started doing backflips. So that was a moment. I suppose the hope might be maybe the Senate isn't completely gone yet. There's some chance that that it goes to 50-49. If the Democrats might just sneak in North Carolina with the votes that come in the more democratic parts of where the universities are, and then you could have what the Americans love to call a buzzer beater with the Georgia special election next month, where the Democrats could steal it and make it 50. Well, they won't steal it, but they might win it and make it 50-50 with Harris as a tiebreaker. So if you're an optimist and just hoping for just a little bit of icing on the cake, that'd be it. But yeah, it feels like it's a good result for, as well as the climate politics that Terry mentions, the global politics of resisting the anti-democratic tendencies of the regimes that are of Russia and China and their growth plans.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the relief, I agree with you. The relief has been an incredible emotion. I, for one, I mean, I knew everyone said we were going to have to wait and we might not get the result until the end. And these are the states, notwithstanding all that knowledge and rationally understanding we had to wait till all the votes were counting. They counted at about 8 o'clock last night. It was hard not to feel a bit sick in the stomach. But once we saw the results turning around in Wisconsin and Michigan, I think that changed. Katie, I just wanted to talk to the panel about what actually happened in terms of what are the lessons that we learned from who voted, how many people voted. It was a record turnout, but but there was increases in the vote share, the number of votes, I should say, that both Biden got and Trump got vis-a-vis Clinton and Trump in 2016. So huge amount of enthusiasm on both sides. I think it has to be said that compared to where some of the public polls were saying we were going to land, the Trump part of that side is a bit surprising. I'm just interested, what are your reflections that Democrats should be taking away from what we saw yesterday in terms of that movement?
You know, I think it's still early days, and I don't think we have enough data in, and we haven't had enough time to process all that we're seeing to really be very conclusive about that. I think it was odd that going into this election, there was sort of a conventional wisdom that increased turnout automatically benefited Democrats. And there wasn't really any science behind that. You know, increased turnout doesn't necessarily mean increased Democratic turnout. So you saw a lot of folks, you know, especially the Twitterati, getting very excited over these big turnout numbers. But it didn't actually, that didn't mean much in terms of telling us where the vote was headed. I think one of the lessons that we failed to learn in 2016 that we failed to implement this time around was this overemphasis on looking at the national polling results, right? Like, this is not a national election. It is a state by state election. And you do not learn very much about that very tricky and treacherous path to 270 electoral votes by looking at the national election. You know, before we counted a single vote yesterday, everybody knew that Joe Biden was going to win the popular vote. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 elections. It is not a popular vote election, and what national polls tell you is about the popular vote. What actually matters is that very sort of laborious work of adding states to your column. And a lot of the forecasting methods that we see, right? These, you know, Nate Silvers of the world that just put everything into a big machine and spit out, you know, an 80% chance of a Biden win. You know, we saw that same thing in 2016, them saying, oh, look, Hillary Clinton's a 90% chance of a win. What that fails to tell you is that in key states, it's still a very close race. It's a very big difference to say to an electorate, hey, there's an 80% chance of a Biden win, or Biden's only 1 to 2 points up in all of the states that he needs to win to make this thing work. And so I'm extremely frustrated that the forecasters did the same thing that they did last time. I'm frustrated by the ongoing fascination with national polls and what that does in terms of seeding a set of expectations that are just unbelievably difficult to meet. And that's, you know, some of what we're seeing in this sort of disappointment, if you like, among some Democrats and some lefties today, even though I can tell you if Republicans had these numbers, they would be out shouting from the rooftops about their historic mandate. You know, like there's no Republican alive who would be not out there on TV banging the drum about how well they did. So I just think we should have a, you know, step back and have a bit of perspective about that as well.
Peter, you know a thing or two about polling, and some of the questions we're already getting are about that. I think listening to a lot of what Katie says, maybe you have a few reflections on that yourself. You know, where are we at in the science of polling? It seems like we've had a few elections where there's been surprises in a row across the UK, US, Australia. You know, what is there a problem? Is there anything that pollsters need to learn and focus on?
I guess the insight that we've really taken on board since last year's election is that be really careful about how polls are used, and they're not predictive tools. They're there to describe a state of affairs before the vote. The idea that people latch onto polls as some form of truth is really problematic, and it should be one form of intelligence along with a lot of other forms of intelligence to understand what's going on the ground. I would not have envied a pollster trying to make sense of what was going on in the States this year. It wasn't just, you know, it's kind of easy over here. We have compulsory voting, so at least we've got a degree of certain variables there. When you've got to then look at whether someone intends to vote, whether they're actually going to vote, whether there's going to be barriers placed in front of them to voting, and whether their vote actually arrives. It's a much more complex scenario. That said, I do think there is a problem in finding particular cohorts of people that may be disengaged with the normal ways that we go about collecting intelligence. And I know the American pollsters went to great pains to find a way of sampling more non-college educated voters this time, but it still seems to have underestimated in some states. I'm thinking Wisconsin in particular, the Trump vote. The big message for me out of this election is that the sense that there would be an election that would get rid of Trump populism and it would all be over has not occurred. As Katie said, they're not going to win the Senate, I don't think, the Democrats, so there won't be widespread electoral reform either. So it's going to be a really tough job for a Biden presidency moving forward. And, pollsters will be kicked because the result isn't what they wanted to, people wanted to have at the end of it. But the alternate is to stop trying to build intelligence and to understand what's going on. And that's probably even worse than living with polls that don't always get it 100% on the money.
Terry, you're an actual politician who has to try and make use of intelligence like polls and other things. And I'm interested in what your reflections on this topic are. And then also, what are your reflections on what happened yesterday that might have bearings for democracy and political opinion in Australia, if any?
On polls, obviously, we've had a lot of cause to reflect here in Australia about why people's behaviour doesn't necessarily reflect what they intended, or at least what they said that they intended to do. I think that's a fairly obvious observation for the past few years, particularly. But I just noticed in the chat, one of the listeners saying, well, one of the problems with polls is that people lie. And I do wonder whether Peter or Katie have any reflections on the kind of whether there's a shy Trump effect in the American polls, whether people are telling pollsters something different to what they intend to do. But
Katie, sorry.
No, I just want to, on that point, I do wonder whether there's also anything to learn about whether there's questions that we can ask or approaches that we can take that more look at revealed preferences rather than expressed preferences. Environmental economics, you look at how much someone's willing to pay to go to a national park, or how many hours they're willing to travel to get to a national park, versus whether they say they like nature and the environment or not. Are there other approaches that I'm not aware of, and it's not my field, that I'm not aware of, that could try to look a little bit more towards what people do rather than what they say they do, or what they say they're going to do when it comes to political behaviour. And on the other issue, on the question of what there is for learnings for us, I think a good place to start is probably, well, what impact did COVID have on this election? I've seen some commentary saying actually it wasn't really about COVID at all. It was about the economy, and whether people's experience of the economy had changed for the better or the worse since President Trump was elected. I would also be really interested in hearing from others on that, because I think COVID probably played a much bigger part in the Queensland election, and the COVID response played a bigger part in the Queensland election than it seems to have done in the much bigger election across the ocean.
Katie, there's a couple of questions for you in that, I think. Do you want to just take them? I think the first is about what you think about the shy Trump voter, and then what effect did COVID have yesterday?
So I think a couple of things. I just want to just do a quick explainer about polling and what people like me do versus the public polls that you see out there. There's sort of two streams to polling, and one of those are internal political pollsters, people like myself who work for candidates. The work that we do does not get distributed publicly. And folks like me in my profession, we're certainly seeing a much closer race. You saw Jen O'Malley-Dillon, Biden's campaign manager, a couple of weeks back say, guys, the public polls are overstating this. Our data is a lot closer. So I do think that there is a distinct quality difference between the public polls and what you see from political pollsters like myself. I also think that we have just seen an explosion of public polling in the United States. Anybody with a robo-dialer or an online panel can just take a poll, and there's a lot of crap. Can I swear on this? There's a lot of shit polls out there, right? Like there are a lot of pollsters that are just putting out junk data. And, the sum of junk data and junk data is not good data. It's just shit data. So there's a lot of bad data out there. There are all of these new polling outfits that don't really pay attention to the internals of their polls the way that people like me do. That being said, it was a miss. Everybody missed it. I am not a believer in the idea of a shy Trump voter, in that the person who is unwilling to tell a pollster that they would vote for Trump. What I am a believer in is the Trump voter who is so cynical about establishments and institutions that they don't take a poll at all. And that is something that I think we have to overcome. You know, most Trump voters are very open about their support for the president. There's no shyness there. But what they are also open about is their disdain for the media, for the political class, for all of it. And their ability to engage with that is very limited, and they just don't have an appetite for it. So I think that is something that pollsters are going to have to sort of come to grips with. You know, you look at some of the polling in the Democratic primary, for example, and it was a lot more spot on. A lot of the internal polls were a lot more spot on because Democrats were more willing to be part of the process than some of these folks on the other side of the aisle. So I think that's a quirk that we don't know how to grapple with yet, and there'll be a lot of soul searching in my industry. One more thing, I know I'm talking a lot here, you'll get to other stuff in a minute, but to me, the COVID question is really interesting because, you know, one thing that the exit poll sort of suggested to me is that the COVID impact sort of came down in two categories, right? There were people who really wanted the pandemic to be dealt with and really wanted a serious science-based approach to containing and ending the spread of COVID. Those people voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. Then there was another group of people, and I think we saw this sort of nervousness start to emerge in the final couple of weeks of the campaign about the prospect of another lockdown, particularly if Biden was to take both the presidency and the Senate. And so you'd have sort of a sweep of the branches of government by Biden and what Democrats might choose to do in terms of economic lockdown. So you see, you know, some of the reason that I think a place like Nevada is close right now is that, you know, a lot of those Clark County Democrats, folks that would normally vote for a Democrat, are casino workers who, you know, they're done if there's another lockdown. Like, that's really harsh on those kind of workers. There's a social element of it where you have a lot of misinformation about COVID spreading throughout the United States, and increasingly, particularly in places with red states with Republican governors, where they're just not really believing that the pandemic is as bad as everybody's making it out to be, that it's just, you know, the Democrats are overhyping it and overblowing it. And so I think there was that other segment of the population that said, I'm not prepared, or I don't have an appetite for a lockdown. And I'm sure all of the sort of Melburnians on the line here could sort of agree that with the toll that takes and the reticence to engage in that, particularly if you're kind of thinking it's not such a big deal. So I think that, to me, and this is very initial, and all of this, you know, obviously it's a bit of a grain of salt kind of stuff here, but the way I see it breaking down is, if you wanted the public health situation to be dealt with, you voted for Biden. If you're worried about another lockdown, you voted for Trump, and that is why we saw, you know, such a divide there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Terry, did you want to follow that up at all?
No, look, I just noticed in the chat some people saying, well, of course, this is a COVID election because every election is now a COVID election. But the question is actually the psychology of COVID. And I think Katie went through that really well, and I think it's something that we could probably all relate to here.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking, is that we're in Melbourne, in Victoria, we're very used to these debates now about opening up versus locking down. And maybe in looking across the United States, we might have not realised how much that's an issue there too. Terry, just, you know, sorry, Peter, you had your hand up. And
I just really quickly to bounce on that. Every election comes down to a question and a choice. And it seemed to me that what Trump managed to do in those last few weeks, instead of making it about how well he'd managed the COVID, which was terrible, was that he made it a choice between, do we want to move past it and open up, or do we want to remain locked in our basement? And he didn't get there, but I think he overperformed because he made that the choice that kept a lot of people in his corner that would have, if the question was different, would have gone back to the Democrats.
Yeah. One person asked, is this the first incumbent to have lost during the pandemic? I thought that was interesting. I mean, we've seen a lot of results in New Zealand, Queensland, other places where the pandemic has actually given leaders a bit of a bounce. Can anyone think of an example where another world leader has paid a penalty, has lost an election? I mean, whether or not they paid a penalty might be a more complicated question. No, I mean, I couldn't either.
No. And across the board, polls have generally, for what they're worth, not only in the English-speaking world, like lots of leaders have seen surges in support.
Yeah. I mean, from that perspective, I mean, going back to Katie's original point that this was a historic victory, in that sense, I mean, that adds to it. If we think that there's an argument that the uncertainty and difficulty would have favoured incumbency. I think we should move on to the next part I wanted to talk about. So that is what happens next in the if we can break it up into two parts. What happens before 21 January, which is Inauguration Day? The concern a lot of people will have is that even if Biden is winning on the votes, that there might be litigation or other problems associated with the way they run their electoral system that mean there's some room for the Republicans to prize this away. Michael, do you want to just talk us through like how that system works and how it differs from ours, and to what extent you think that's a risk?
Yeah, I guess one way to think about it is, as Katie says, there's 50 elections really. A lot of each different state running an election for its delegation to the Electoral College. And they stopped voting sometime yesterday, and in many places on election day really late, like 11 o'clock at night, so that people can vote after work. And so counting, in a lot of places, they've only been counting votes for 24 hours, right? So it feels very long and can look to our expectations really chaotic. But really what's happening is that they're now counting votes in the states where their delegation of the Electoral College is still undecided. And so one question becomes, well, will they keep counting votes, and which votes exactly will they count? And that's governed in each state by each different state's actual laws. So there's not a single electoral roll, there's not a single electoral set of arrangements. And so many of us would have seen yesterday afternoon, our time, the president say that he wanted to go to the Supreme Court to stop something's happening. Well, it doesn't start that way. It starts really with lots of disputes in lots of individual places about whether the procedures being put in place locally are as they should be, and then the lawyers turn up. For those of us who volunteered in Australian elections as scrutineers and been involved in the counting of votes in Australian elections, there's relatively minor disputes about where the posters should be, or are people standing outside the 6 metre zones and stuff like that. But these become disputes that are more significant about which votes are getting counted. And so they're happening straight away, not over weeks and weeks in a close couple of seats. So if you think about the seats the states rather that are still kind of most in play and are most going to decide it, like Nevada, where Biden is leading, and if he gets that, he really wins. Pennsylvania, where Trump is leading, but it gets closer every time you look. North Carolina and Georgia, which also gets closer every single time I refresh my browser, where Biden's now only 40,000 votes behind. What's happening right now, I guess, is that lawyers are turning up saying, stop counting this thing, stop counting that thing, pause this thing. Those votes should be in that pile. You've got rules about when you're allowed to open postal votes. You've got rules about when you're allowed to open mail-in votes. That one arrived on Friday. It was supposed to arrive on Thursday. Those kind of disputes start at a local level with local and state officials. And the state officials are going to make rulings of various kinds that will then be challenged in state courts, and ultimately in national courts to decide whether those counts continue.
Terry, before you were a member of Parliament, you were a lawyer at a very highly esteemed law firm. Just wondering if you've got any legal insights into what the litigation strategy in play is going to look like.
Well, look, it's a very different system. I would have to think in this case, where you're talking about, as everyone said, a state-by-state approach. Their first attempt will actually be the recounts rather than the litigation in those states where they think they might be able to make it up. But litigation, obviously, if you're Trump, if you are President Trump, I should say, you are trying to prevent a situation where people know the outcome of the full count, aren't you? So you, I suppose, be looking to states where you think it's likely that you would, one, be able to get an injunction, and two, be able to get one in enough of a timely manner that you could prevent the final results from being determined, because that then helps you to undermine the legitimacy of the count, right? And so what we've seen from him, on election night, trying to undermine the legitimacy of the entire process by saying that there's fraud, by claiming victory, that's clearly, I think, part of a broader litigation would be part of a broader strategy of delegitimization.
I think that became clear today when Trump criticised his own lawyers, because I think what's really clear is that the lawyers understand that any legal strategy is not one overarching strategy to stop all counting right now, but a 100 little battles about this patch of votes or that patch of votes. And Trump tweeted today that he was disappointed that his lawyers were arguing over the transparency of the scrutiny, given that what's that got to do with stealing an election, which I think gives away that Trump's strategy, litigation strategy, is a political strategy, not a litigation strategy. And in that respect, Katie, can you tell us what does that mean? Like to say that the vote's being stolen, that very strange performance he did at 2 a.m. American time last night. What does that augur for the next couple of months?
Well, a couple of things. Look, the Biden camp was very well prepared for this and have a veritable army of lawyers at their disposal. I think most of the challenges, I'm no legal expert, but it does not seem like most of the legal challenges have a lot of standing and probably won't ultimately affect the outcome of the election from an actual votes perspective. But clearly, as Terry alluded to, what he is trying to do is cast a pall of illegitimacy over the entire process. And what part of that is about is speaking to his base, of making himself more of a martyr to this rigged system that he has always sort of cast himself as an outsider to, that he's the anti-establishment character. And this is the establishment coming back to haunt him and coming back to undermine him. And while I don't think it ultimately changes the outcome of the election, even if, he's asked for a recount in Wisconsin. The last time we did a recount in Wisconsin, I think 131 votes changed. Things are not going to change dramatically because of those recounts. But what it does do is sort of elongate this sense that something fishy happened, that Democrats are suspect, that Democrats are trying to pull a fast one over a lot of unsuspecting voters who they don't respect and don't like, that the coastal elites are looking down on you and sort of perpetuating all of that grievance towards other people in the country, which is the distinct opposite of what we saw Joe Biden come out and do last night and this morning, Australia time, when he talked about, we are not each other's enemies. We have to respect the process, respect the votes, respect the voice of the people. And one of the things that's been quite remarkable about the Biden campaign, in my view, is the degree to which from day one, from his very first announcement to now, he's had a real clarity and consistency of message about what his campaign is about, which has been about overcoming division, bringing about more unity, about compassion and decency, and, in his words, healing the soul of the nation. He has said that from his first ad, he said it in his closing ad, he said it at his convention speech, he said it last night, he said it this morning. And this from a person who has a reputation as, being, a bit off message sometimes, not necessarily like, gaff machine is a word that's been used to describe him in the past. And yet what he has done is lay very bare for people his view of the presidency as a unifying figure, as a president for all Americans, not just Democrats and not just Republicans. And that is such a polar opposite to what we hear from Trump, who is really just a president for the people who voted for him. And, when you talk about, someone earlier on the panel said that, elections are often about one big thing. They're also a contest of vision and values, not a contest of issues, right? And that vision and values contrast could not have been more clear in this election. And fortunately, Joe Biden's vision and values won. But what Trump is trying to do is continue to chip away at that sense that, that things are fishy, that people like him and the people that support him are not respected and should be and a right to be angry, and that's going to make for some ugliness.
So Peter, do you have any insight into how ugly this gets? I mean, the president was telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. There are some militia groups trying to do all sorts of mayhem, and one was trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. I mean, with the president casting doubt on the legitimacy of this election and still being the occupant of the Oval Office for the next 2 months with these kind of dog whistles, how bad could it get?
Yeah, there's this, there's kind of this sense that he's Dr. Evil, and this is all coming to a head, and he gutted the post office to slow it down. He politicized the courts. We know, the stories about Florida and the way that the Supreme Court stopped the vote. We know that 3 members of Bush's team in 2000 are now on the Supreme Court. So there's this nightmare scenario I think a lot of us sort of have conjured up in the recesses of our mind, that this is all a plan by Trump to steal the election. Of course, the Red Mirage he had a crack at it last night. But I've always wondered, and I'm interested in particularly Katie's view on this, is Trump a genius, or is he just harnessed celebrity to bomb politics? Firstly, he bombed the Republican establishment, then he bombed the Democrats, and now he's bombed politics in general. And if it is just celebrity, I think the system will sustain itself. It's been interesting, even Pence last night didn't back Trump in. The sense that this play, this Dr. Evil play, is going to get the support of the Republicans. I think the political establishment, if they're ever going to hold the line, it will be now. The numbers are the numbers. And I think we can get a little bit overwrought about what comes next. It seems to me the conditions are now in place, from all the numbers up on my screen, for later today, Biden to say, I've got to 270, whatever happens in Pennsylvania. There will be lawyers and there will be cases, but I kind of feel that I don't know. I really hope that the whole place doesn't go off in flames, and I think there's a lot of people riding on it not happening.
Katie, I think we all hope that, Peter. Katie, what do you reckon? Is it just a celebrity bomb that's going to disappear, or is there something more sinister at play?
I guess I think about it a little bit differently, which is that I don't think Trump is an evil genius. I don't think he's particularly competent at a lot of aspects of his job. But some of the things that we're talking about here have actually been projects of the Republican Party for quite some time, decades even. You think about stacking the courts full of judges. This is something that Republicans have been trying to do for a long time. Gutting the post office isn't a Trump idea. That's been a Republican orthodoxy for a long time. So I think some of the actions that he took, while they may seem very Trumpian, can't be divorced from the broader context of a Republican Party that knows demographically it is in decline, that knows that its electoral fate over the long term hinges on a smaller and wider group of essentially rural and ex-urban voters, and doing what it can to arrange the levers of power to maximize their influence. So Trump and Trumpism, Trump is a figurehead. When he goes, Trumpism will still exist. And Trumpism has actually conducted a wholesale takeover of the Republican Party, and dovetails very nicely with some of the more corporate objectives of the Republican Party that they've had for quite some time. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I don't know. I don't think he's an evil genius. I don't know that he's just a celebrity bomb either. I think that it's a little bit more nuanced than that he is somebody who has been a convenient vessel for some long time Republican priorities, and has also brought with him his own charisma, his own appeal, his very unique ability to dog whistle to certain groups of people, and sometimes use a bullhorn to certain groups of people, particularly when it comes to issues of race. So yeah, he's quite a unique figure in my view.
Terry, Michael, do you want to add to this topic at all?
I just thought the analogy that jumps out at me is with Abbott, who had a strategy to win government but couldn't really keep government with it. And if I'm a little optimistic, I suppose, about what a result like this indicates for whether in advanced democratic societies this kind of conservative populist politics can really be sustained. There's not many examples of this kind of leader winning and then being able to hold on to office. In the US, it's not a majority strategy. He's never going to win a majority of American voters. It's an artifact of their electoral system that allows him to even be close to governing when he's so far behind on the head-to-head vote. And so I think that it does suggest that, sometimes I suppose the question for progressives is that should we still think that when they go low, we go high, or is there a kind of an obligation now to kind of fight fire with fire? And I suppose it feels like part of the lesson is, I guess, not really, because it just doesn't look like a strategy that can get you to both win and then sustain a government that does things for extended periods. I guess that's in some respects a promising learning.
Terry, what do you think about right-wing populism and its ability to run effective governments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that's coming out of COVID is that people are being reminded of the material importance of government to their day-to-day lives. People have actually, throughout this crisis, been reminded that the decisions that government makes, that governments plural make, determine not just really whether you have a job or not, but things as basic as freedom of movement and whether you survive. So I think when you have a tendency towards a more materialist view of politics, then that means taking politics seriously again. Previously, I think one of the things that's benefited both right-wing and left-wing populists has been people thinking that everything's going to be fine. It doesn't really matter who's running the show because the sensible people in the room are everything. So there's been a bit of a tendency to vote on more cultural or protest grounds, which has served the interests of populists like Tony Abbott. Now, I think there's probably a tendency that actually it does matter who you vote for. It can affect your life, and so maybe you better cast your vote a little bit more sensibly, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm wrong about this, but the incumbents that have won on the back of COVID have been sort of moderate incumbents who've done a good job of the health response. Now we've got an incumbent who's lost on the back of COVID, who was a populist incumbent whose health response was very poor. Perhaps that's one of the differences.
Mm. Well, thanks. Then lastly, and then leaving some time for questions from the audience, I just wanted to talk about what happens after the 21st of January. And in particular, if we're looking at a world where Biden is the president, but the Senate is still in Republican hands, the issue I'd be concerned about is climate change. Terry, can you tell us, what do you think a Biden administration can do to progress some serious action on climate change if they don't have the ability to legislate?
Well, I think there's a lot that they can do, and a lot of the announcements that he has made have been very internationally focused, and that's really important because what we need as a world, as a globe, is a United States that actually both has the capacity to and the inclination to exercise influence towards generating more serious action on climate change. So the commitment to re-enliven the US's commitment to Paris on day one is important, not just for the domestic policies that will come with that, but also for the symbolic and cultural value of the commitment to Paris, but also his commitment to lead a diplomatic mission to encourage the countries of the world, particularly the large emitters of the world, to not just meet their voluntarily assumed Paris commitments, but to increase them, I think is really important. It'll be game changing. This is about a president who has a stated aim of bringing $1.7 trillion of investment into climate change in the US, but just as importantly, I think a stated aim of getting the world to step up in relation to climate. And that will have ramifications here for sure, significant, the most significant trading and security partner for our nation, taking new and renewed international leadership on climate change, might even be enough to drag the likes of Scott Morrison kicking and screaming to acknowledging that more needs to be done.
Katie, on climate change, I think Terry's just talked us through what he can do on an international stage. What about in terms of actually just reducing emissions in the United States? What can he do there?
So I'm not a policy expert, but what I do know is that under the Trump administration, they very aggressively rolled back a whole series of regulations about fossil fuels, fuel standards, everything from, mercury and lead in water to carbon emissions that the Obama administration had put in over a series of years. And those things are very relatively easy for Biden to reinstate. So there are a lot of executive action orders that can be taken unilaterally by the president, which are, precedented both by Trump and by President Obama. So there are ways in which he can make a material impact. In terms of legislation, looks very tricky with the Republican Senate. I don't see how any meaningful legislation gets through. But I can imagine, through the process of budget reconciliation, which, happens and will pass, that infrastructure investments, job creating investments that the Biden administration make, particularly those targeted to red states, will sneak through. And the sense that I get from the Biden camp is that they do view climate change very much through an economic lens, that they do view it through, the importance of creating infrastructure for the longevity of the economy, but also for the jobs that entails at this moment in, where there's an extreme recession in the United States. So I think there is hope for action. Biden has certainly made it, been very open about his commitment to climate change. I think what is interesting from a public opinion perspective is the degree to which public opinion is now very much on the side of wanting action from the government. I don't think that means Green New Deal level action, but I do think that the vast majority of Americans do want to see some active steps taken sooner rather than later to combat the effects of climate change. And you see that in red states and in blue states, because farmers are suffering, people living on coasts are suffering, people, floods, all of these extreme weather events bring it home to people, both in terms of the cost of their insurance and all of that, but also in things like food prices and food availability. So, there's more of a consensus among the population that people want to move forward that is divorced from the reality of Republican leadership, unfortunately. But I'm fairly hopeful that through executive action and other sort of spot programs throughout other pieces of legislation that we could see some meaningful movement on climate change.
Well, that's good. Peter, there was a worldwide Pew poll that showed that America's reputation with people outside the United States had taken a nosedive under President Trump. And at the very least, it's fair to say he's been very unpredictable compared to his predecessors on the global stage. How does a President Biden restore the moral authority of the United States, both in the minds of people around the world and in governments around the world, from this very strange period we've had?
Well, I assume he will not continue the practice of sucking up to dictators. I would assume that he will find a way to take America back into Paris and some of those other, multilateral forums that, Trump pulled America out of. So, the good news is that the power of the president is to make those calls globally that doesn't rely on a Senate. So I think globally, Biden will begin the task of rebuilding relations. He'll probably try to staff the State Department so there's actually humans in chairs building those ties, which again would be, a step in the right direction. But I also don't think we can think, oh, well, everything's sorted. I think America, China, and where Australia sits is still going to be wickedly difficult to navigate a way through, but at least it will be navigated by somebody who is wanting to create unity rather than division. So, I think internationally, the change is all positive. The real question in my head is how the Republicans, and assuming McConnell keeps the role, how they play their role in the Senate and whether they continue that nihilistic destruction, or whether Biden, who has proclaimed himself as a centrist, is able to form some form of unity so that America can rebuild itself from the pandemic. And, I think the rest of the globe will be looking on and wishing America well in that pursuit, because it's not in our interest to see the place going where it's going.
Terry, what are your views about it? What a Biden administration represents for politics in our region and the bilateral Australia-US relationship in particular?
Well, I'm hopeful that it'll improve the relationship. Of course, people will remember that it took the Trump administration 2 years to appoint an ambassador to Australia. And that I thought was quite disappointing because it sent the wrong sort of signal about how significant Australia was to the US. Of course, US, in the other direction, the US is very significant to us, as I said, both as a security and a trading partner, but more broadly for the international leadership role that we want the US to be able to fill, because the world needs a good, strong democratic power with the same values as ours. It's the point that that President Obama made when he came to Queensland for G20 and gave a great, I thought it was a really fantastic address about the importance of shared values. I mean, it's really important. You know, we saw the Obama administration look towards the Pacific in a way that the Trump administration just hasn't, in my view, continued to do. There's been a bit of ups and downs in the relationship in relation to trade, of course, and you know that's been in a bilateral sense, but also the Trump administration's attacks on the WTO. It's in Australia's interest, I think, to have a strong WTO and to buy into it and support from the US for it. I guess from my perspective, I'd certainly hope that a Biden administration will be deeply committed to an international rules-based order, will be deeply committed to our long-standing relationship with the US, and will want to work with, as I said, our Prime Minister, including to work with him to put some pressure on him, frankly, to improve his game when it comes to climate change, because at the moment, the Liberals and Nationals here in Australia are effectively getting tacit support for their pathetic attitude to climate change from the fact that you've got a US that's of a similar disposition. So hopefully a bit of international leadership will help us domestically becoming a country that is more committed to taking real action on climate change.
Yeah, I hope that's right. I did know that in the campaign, Joe Biden said that climate change would be the central focus of his foreign policy, which is really, I think, a significant change. I don't think that could be said of even the Obama administration. Michael, in foreign policy, I mean, to what extent does the division in the United States that's been exposed in the last 4 years kind of undermine Biden in relation to diplomacy, in the sense that anyone trying to cut a deal with Biden has to worry about who's coming next?
Yeah, it is a paradox for him. I mean, he's got more power as a result of winning than he would as a result of losing, of course. That's a net gain. But I think the other advantage Biden brings is that stability and predictability means that he can actually build multilateral cooperation between multiple points of cooperation, like Trump's inability to assemble a national security or international team around him, or his inability to see anything through, means that he's entirely reliant on bilateral relationships, and even they're not very effective, right? So I'm struck that what Biden can do effectively, you'd hope, is cooperate with India and Japan and Australia in a single conversation that works and is effectively networked and supported by diplomatic leadership and military leadership, and can talk to each other about what to do. So it's not just a series of kind of strongman relationships and conversations. So I think that's quite promising, not only on climate, although centrally on climate, but on managing China's rise too. And that also, creates a whole network of channels that aren't these kind of high profile, high stakes, get it through the Senate or don't kind of showdown moments, but rather are building habits. And I guess also, like, he's sure that he'll be a good, for instance, as Terry points out, he'll be a better influence on the Australian government on climate, and he'd have to be a better influence on the Indian government on democracy generally, really too. And so, like, the illiberal tendencies that you see playing out around the world are at play in Indian politics too. And India's not much use as a bulwark against China if it's another illiberal power, although it's a long, long, long way from China's version of illiberalism. So, so I think that is a huge benefit, because really the win that China, the Chinese regime and the Russian regime get out of and Orban and others in Eastern Europe get out of defeats for the democratic idea is really powerful. And so this is a big counter victory.
Thank you. Well, lastly, I just wanted to talk about what happens in the US now, and how does President Biden sort of do what he said he was going to do, which is heal the soul of the nation. Katie, as the American on the panel, maybe you could tell us what you think happens there. But how does he go about that job? And related to that, we've got a question from the audience, which is Trump going to run in 2024? I think it's related, because if there's a 4-year presidential campaign from Donald Trump, that might make stealing the soul of the nation a bit harder.
Look, I think Biden's task on this front is monumental and is going to take years and probably will go beyond his presidency. The work of making sure people trust institutions again, making sure they trust news organizations again. But the most important thing that he can do is just use the power of the bully pulpit, as we've already seen him do, to sort of just like take the temperature down a little bit, just take a little bit of the air out of that very hot bubble. And I think that, the fact that we won't turn on the news every single night and see some kind of, unpredictable, often vitriolic, often rude and nasty proclamation from the Oval Office will do a world of good mentally for the US, that we won't be consumed 24/7 with this, caricature of a president as we have been with Trump. I don't think Trump goes quietly. I don't think, we will see, he will be a force in US politics for some time. I don't know if he runs again. Part of me thinks he doesn't actually really like being president very much, and he's actually much happier just, throwing bombs from the outside. I mean, that's the hopeful part of me. And if he doesn't, I certainly think, somebody in his family probably gives it a go. But 2024, a lot of strange things have happened. You know what I mean? Like I worked for the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who, won the Iowa caucuses and was the first, gay candidate to win electoral votes in the Democratic primary. So, nobody would have thought that was possible a few years ago. So, 4 years is a long time in politics. We've got midterms to deal with before we even get to that. But, I think in some ways, the biggest challenge facing Biden is the ongoing, fight against Trumpism tonally, and in terms of how people treat each other, how they speak to each other. I think he is very well suited to do that as a very decent, very kind, very empathetic person who sort of has compassion and has that ability to put himself in other people's shoes. One of the good things about Joe Biden being the standard bearer of the Democratic Party is that his was always a big tent approach. His was never a purity test approach. He never sort of said, unless you're with me on everything, you're not with me at all. He was very encompassing in terms of wanting people to be on his side and knowing that, we will have disagreements and we don't have to agree 100% on things all of the time, but we just have to agree that we care about the country. It's a very old school, sort of sentiment now. But I think that his just core humanity and core decency will start to move the ball forward on that. But I don't think it's going to be easy. And one of the big sort of villains in all of this, in my view, are tech platforms like Facebook and like Twitter and like 4chan and Reddit and all of these places that are just the Wild West in terms of misinformation and untruth. And finding a way to deal with that and rein that in is a really big problem. And I don't know if that's something that we'll solve anytime soon.
Well, thank you. Kay started off optimistic. Peter, Terry, Michael, let's just do last round of comments, because I think we need to start wrapping it up. Peter, do you want to go first?
The big question, I think, is not whether Biden can heal America, but whether America wants to be healed. Is the division structural, and whether the breakup of big tech, particularly Facebook, is the condition precedent for healing America?
Terry?
Yeah, absolutely right. And the question is whether polarization continues or whether people can bring themselves back together. And that is, as Katie and as Peter have just said, in a lot of ways, technologies. Facebook, obviously, deeply important. Let's not forget YouTube, the second biggest search engine in the world, the home of so much right-wing deliberate disinformation, but also just the creator of cultures that are sort of gateway drugs towards more hard right ideologies. There's a whole range of online communications technologies that are causing difficulties, and we just don't, they're sort of under the surface. We just don't necessarily even see them unless we're involved in it.
Michael?
Just a little speech nerd note. As a washed-up speechwriter, Terry referred to President Obama's speech at University of Queensland when he visited Brisbane in 2014, and I just shared it in the chat. It's a really, really nice speech with a very lovely David Malouf quote that everyone should check out, especially any patriotic Brisbane people we've got here. And my cat has now settled in another room, so thank you all. Thank you all. She's now quite popular.
So my one sort of crowning glory of my time working with the Obama White House is the beer reference that I got into that speech. So
very good.
They were going to say VB, and I was like, "You're in Queensland. It's not happening. Read the room."
Well done.
Good. You need to make sure there's a Queenslander in every team, I think. Get that right. Katie, do you have any last reflections?
I think everyone's probably sick of hearing of me now. No, I've said more than enough.
Well, thank you to all our panelists for joining. Thanks for everyone participating. I think there's been some remarks that people have felt better out of that. If I can just add my own 2 cents, I think that it's pretty clear America's got some pretty serious problems, from vast inequality to a huge fight over identity of the nation. But I do think that having a sociopathic, divisive loudmouth in the White House is worse than having a man of the decency and compassion of Joe Biden. So if they're to address those problems, at least having Joe Biden in the White House will put them in a better stead to start tackling those problems, which isn't at all to understate the mountain that the nation, I think, needs to climb. But thank you, everyone, for participating. We have all proceeded on the basis that we think Biden's going to win. I'd just recommend everyone knock on wood or Laminex or whatever's to hand, because it's not yet done, even if that's the way it looks like it will be. But thank you, everyone, for joining in. I think that was a fun discussion.
Cheers, everyone.